So, good afternoon, everyone. And I can see that we do have some people here. There's about 25 people who are in the audience, Jennifer. My name's Linda Harvey-Ryu, and I'm the Indigenous Cultural Competency Coordinator for the Pragmatic Trials Training Program. It's taken me a year and a half, almost 2 years, to actually get that mouthful out straight. I think I've done a pretty good job. So, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is a fourth and final session for the speaker series follow-up to the First Nations Principles of OCAP course. So it's my pleasure to have you all here. And as I was saying earlier, these have all been recorded. And if you're interested in seeing ones that you haven't been able to attend, they'll all be available eventually, all four of them, on our website, for the Pragmatic Trials website. So to start, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on. We acknowledge that the Pragmatic Trials Training Program Coordinating Team's offices located in London, Ontario, are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Nape, and Attawandaron. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. We also recognize that our work is carried out on the traditional territories of First Nation, Inuit, Métis peoples from coast to coast, and we are thankful that we are able to work and collaborate on these lands. So just to mention that we are pan-Canadian, and people who are attending today could be anywhere from Vancouver to Newfoundland. So thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to work for the last 2 years with our Indigenous Knowledge Keepers, and I would like to introduce them, or I would like to go to them now and ask them to introduce themselves. And they have kindly offered to do a smudge ceremony today to start us off. So Helen?
Yeah. Hi, thank you, Linda. Good morning, everybody. My name is Helen Robinson Settee in Anishinaabemowin, which is Ojibwe here in my territory, which I am currently residing in, is Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I'm a knowledge keeper slash grandmother. And I've been working with Dr. Emmett Garg and his team, including Linda, on the Pragmatic Trials training as an Indigenous knowledge keeper, along with Dr. Mary Wilson, who should be here shortly. And so my role on here as Indigenous knowledge keeper also stems from myself also being the mother of my youngest son, lived with chronic kidney disease since he was 10 years old and required a kidney transplant when he was 19 years old. And my older son donated a kidney to him. So I have experience not only working with children nephrologists, but also with the adult nephrologists with my son. So I'm very honored to be able to share my knowledge and expertise in that area. But right now I'm going to lead you through a smudge ceremony. And for those of you who haven't smudged before, I'm going to be using one of our medicines, which is sage. This is prairie sage. And there's a difference between the different sages. Some of you might be from the mountain area like Alberta, and British Columbia have like mountain sage, and people kind of east of us here in Manitoba also have different types of sage. Sometimes the leaves are larger, sometimes they grow on sticks, like literally on sticks. But this one here is prairie sage, grows in some of our open fields here. So when we smudge, I'm going to light it right away when we smudge, and you'll just see the flames coming because we're doing a virtual smudge. So the flame, you'll see not the flames, but you'll see the smoke rising. And what you can do is you can smudge your head so that when you're smudging your head, you're asking for good thoughts for the meeting today and in your work you're doing. We smudge our eyes. I actually take my glasses off. You can smudge your eyes as well too. And then you smudge your ears, and so that you'll hear all those good things, see all the good things in the work that you do. You smudge your mouth so that you'll have all those good words, and then you can smudge your whole being, and some people even smudge their glasses, their other eyes. And so we just think of positive thoughts when we're going to smudge, and do it if you feel comfortable. It's always optional. Especially when you're in person, we always say it's always optional for people to smudge or not. So I'm just lighting this now with a match. And I will, so I use a little shell here. There's a shell that I'm using, and here's the smoke. So you can do that virtual smudge. You can smudge your head, smudge your eyes, your mouth, your ears, and your whole being. There you go. Can't hear you, Linda.
Well, there we go. Technology. Thank you so much, Helen. What a
So
wonderful
there's,
way. What a wonderful way to start our session today. I really appreciate it. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker is Dr. Jennifer Walker. And Dr. Jennifer Walker is a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. She has a PhD in Community Health Sciences Epidemiology from the University of Calgary. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Health Data and Aging at McMaster University, and she's a professor in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence, and Impact. Dr. Walker has demonstrated significant national and international leadership in aging and dementia research, as well as Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. She's a co-lead in the Indigenous Cognitive Health Program with the Canadian Consortium of Neurodegeneration and Aging, a national CIHR-funded dementia research network. Her research program has contributed to significant advancements in culturally safe approaches for dementia prevention and diagnosis, including the validation and implementation of the Canadian Indigenous Cognitive Assessment Tool and a new transformative project on decolonizing holistic health, brain health assessment. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us, and it's over to you.
Thank you, and Miigwech, Helen, and Yahweh. Very, I am so grateful actually that you started that way. I had to be working at home today because are having we had a lot of snow. And so I didn't have all my things close on hand. So I ran into the other room and I got my own smudge stuff and my eagle feather, and it really helped me. So I'm very grateful for that, Helen. I'm gonna set up by sharing my screen. I'm just so excited actually for the opportunity to be here, to be talking to you all. One of the things that I guess I didn't have clear in my bio is that I also have a role in, I have had since the beginning of HDR in Canada, a role in thinking about, sorry, I'm having trouble with my sharing so give me just 1 second. I can't do two things at once.
That's okay. Just start
Yeah,
your slides there.
there we go. I think I got it there. Are you seeing the right one?
There it is. Perfect.
Okay,
Yep.
excellent. Great. Thank you. And I can see all of you on my screen. So yeah, so I do have a role in HDR in Canada. I know this is connected to HDR in Canada, and I've done a lot of thinking about administrative health data and the use of data, use of Indigenous data in those contexts. So that's some of the knowledge that I'm bringing here. And you know, it's interesting being at sort of the tail end of a series of talks. So I know you've got actually a lot of training now. You've done like, I know this is an OCAP series, so you've got some knowledge there. So it's kind of interesting thinking about what to bring to this conversation and how to enhance that conversation. So I'm really happy to be flexible as well. I've prepared I prepared by thinking about how we actually, you know, once we understand Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance principles, what then do we do, and how do we do it? So hopefully we'll get to that, because I didn't want to sort of give you another intro conversation, but I don't know how ready you are to go even further than what I have prepared. So I say that all up front to say that I can see you all on my screen. So if you need to stop me and you want to have more of a dialogue and less of a presentation, I'm also very open to that. So you can ask me questions as we go, and this can be hopefully a connected conversation. Always feels weird to be having these really important conversations on the other side of a screen when I can't see and feel you in the room. So definitely anything you need, you let me know. So I wanted to start just with my own acknowledgement about where I am. So I'm Haudenosaunee. I'm a member of Six Nations of the Grand River, and I live and work in Hamilton, which is in close to Six Nations, and in this territory that is represented with this wampum here. If you can see the wampum belt there, that is the Dish wampum belt. So and often these wampums have emerged out of agreements between nations. This is an old one that represents that sort of relationship between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people for this area, this geographic area where I am right now. So it's often referred to as a dish with one spoon treaty. And it's about the sharing of resources, really. It's about taking what we need, but not too much. It's about remembering that there are other people to share with, and it's coming as equal partners in a sharing, so that, you know, of the abundance of this actual territory and this land. And sometimes it helps me to start actually, not just with saying, you know, these are the lands of whoever, but also the way that we related to each other was in the spirit of sharing and reciprocity. So I want to bring that as a way of starting this conversation, so that we are sharing in a spirit of reciprocity. This is the line of Mohawk women in my family. So I'm Jen Walker, and I come from the waters of Julia Candlish, who comes from the waters of Margaret Jessie Londo, who comes from the waters of Helen Marcella Newhouse. And then I don't have any pictures of the women from before that. And right now, so you heard that I do a lot of work in aging and dementia research. Right now, so I've been doing that work for quite a while. And only in the past few years have I started to experience the direct impacts of dementia in my own family. So my grandma right there, Margaret Londo, is currently the full-time care partner for my grandpa, who has dementia. And so, you know, we're learning about it as a family in a really different way than I've been learning about it as a researcher and as an academic and someone who, you know, has been, you know, engaging with communities, engaging with elders. It's really different when it's sort of your own family calling you and saying, well, what do we actually do? Like, what does that mean for how we actually live together? And what does it mean for decisions we need to make together? And, you know, we all come with many parts of ourselves into our research and our conversations. So that's another thing as learners that I want you to know, is that it's okay to come as a whole person to your work. And it's actually a really important part of how we show up in relationships as researchers. And even if you're working with data, and you're not actually, you're not actually face to face with individual people, each of those, sorry, I all of a sudden want to tell a story. I have to decide if I can pace myself and tell stories or if I need to keep going. But just really that we need to show up as whole people. We need to acknowledge that each data point is a whole person, and that we come together in relationship to do this kind of research, even if you're sitting on this side of a computer screen and writing, code in R or whatever you happen to be, whatever your role happens to be, or you're writing the proposal, or it's still a relationship. And so acknowledging that and coming to it with the spirit of reciprocity. The story I was going to tell, I'm going to tell anyway, quickly, and that is one like you know this, but you come to understand these principles and these ways of working in different ways. So I started as an epidemiologist, and I studied at the University of Calgary in a medical school. I was not doing Indigenous health research. I wasn't trained that way. I was trained in a medical school as an epidemiologist. And as soon as I graduated, I started working in First Nations, Inuit, Métis health. Like I was working at a national level with data and trying to build relationships around administrative health data sets with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis at the national level. And I think that I immediately learned that all the things that I knew about being distant from the data and using the data to tell stories that someone else was going to do something about, all of that was changed. All of that had to change because we had to come to it in relationship. So over many years, so that's 20 years ago, over many years, I've been developing that learning. And it's hard sometimes when you haven't had a lot of other people building that space. There's not a lot of PhD trained epidemiologists who are Indigenous in Canada. So we're still kind of learning about it and building up our methods and how we do things. And one key learning point for me was working with some communities in Northern Ontario. There was a kind of collaboration of organizations that served their communities, and there were about 75 communities collectively served by these Indigenous organizations in Northern Ontario. And they chose to do an analysis of data at ICES, where I'm a scientist. And you've already heard from Dominique, so you know all about that data governance at ICES. But what they wanted to start with was an analysis of mortality data. And the way that they approached the data was so spiritual in lots of ways. The advisory committee, it was sort of like, these are the stories of our ancestors, because they were community members who had passed away. And so when we were accessing data about those community members, it was a way of learning from the stories of those ancestors, even if they were little kids. When they passed, it was a way of learning from those ancestors. And so that added a whole layer of spirituality to the data analysis that I learned from. And so I'm just always hoping to learn and continuing to learn about how we actually do this in relationship when we actually think about the data that we're using. So when I think about Indigenous data, I think that there's often motivations that people have. Let's say you're designing a pragmatic trial. There's several motivations you might have for why you want to use Indigenous data, why there's an Indigenous research question in your project. Sometimes it's very distinctly Indigenous data for equity. You want to see if you sort of see Indigenous populations as equity deserving groups, and you want to see if there are inequities. You want to understand quality of care. You want to understand if there is your motivation is around equity. Sometimes they come at the same time, but another fairly distinct way of thinking, motivation and reason that people want to include Indigenous data is because this research conversation or this research question is centered on Indigenous strength and sovereignty. Because you're working with Indigenous nations, Indigenous organizations, Indigenous people to answer questions that are very specific to Indigenous people. I'm not saying these are completely mutually exclusive. They go together for sure. But what I've learned in kind of consulting with researchers who are trying to figure things out and how to best approach Indigenous data in their research projects, people generally fall into one of these two categories. They want to know if there's fair, accessible healthcare for lots of groups, including Indigenous people, or they're actually working with it, or they are an Indigenous nation or community, and they want to answer questions that will help move away from using research and data to shine a light on problems, like are there inequities, to Indigenous peoples using research and data to find and guide a path forward to healing. And I want to encourage you to think that way. I want to encourage you to be thinking about these Indigenous data sovereignty principles and Indigenous data governance principles that you've already had a chance to learn about, that they will help to move away from just being a checkbox for permission to access data so you can tell stories about Indigenous people, to actually moving to the reason for those data governance principles of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession, and the Métis specific data governance principles, which if you haven't seen, I will find and link in the chat. They were recently published, a new publication on Métis data governance. And these, I want to encourage you to think about this as a pathway to help facilitate Indigenous sovereignty. It's a mechanism for Indigenous sovereignty to help find and guide a path forward to healing that's led by Indigenous people. So the next question, I skipped ahead. So when we think about it that way, it challenges a little bit the way we typically do things. So when I first became the Indigenous lead at ICES, which I did for about 10 years, I had so many consultations with researchers who were struggling with the Indigenous data governance principles, because they were very accustomed, for example, to showing maps of Ontario. So ICES has this, all the administrative health data in Ontario. They're accustomed to producing maps over and over and over again. Like maps seems to be a thing that people really like to show like rates of injuries, to show like quality of care, to show, how common, it's probably been used for transplants. I'm not sure, Helen, but these kind of maps almost always have the same hotspots. And often it's Indigenous communities where you have higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of injuries, higher rates of cardiovascular disease. And so then what is the helpfulness of continuing to show high rates of things? It actually can do harm. So this is not something I learned as a epidemiologist in training. It was sort of like, yeah, tell the stories, shine the light. Someone will do something about it. As soon as you tell people there's an inequity, they're gonna do something about it. And that's not true. Like I can tell you from years and years of now working in Indigenous health research that showing that there's an inequity and a problem is not solving the problem. And so it's not just that it's neutral, it can actually cause harm. So if we continue to tell negative, deficit-based stories about Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, it contributes to stereotyping and marginalization. And if you haven't seen media about racism and the devastating consequences of racism in Canadian healthcare, then you need to do some work, because it is there and it's clear. This presentation is not going to, sorry, the emotions coming out as coughs. Um, I'm not going to tell all those stories right now because it really is very hard to hear. And when I'm in a room and people are telling those stories over and over again, it's very sad, it's very traumatic, it's very hard. So I'm not going to tell those stories over and over again. But if you haven't read those stories and heard those stories, then that's some work you need to do. But the contributing to those narratives actually poses a real risk. If we continue to just show deficits, we're posing a real risk for how people will be treated in the healthcare system. And so it's very important that we shift away from telling the stories of deficits, despair, difference, deprivation. So how can we do that if we don't understand? And I will tell you that one of the key things is that people don't understand. You know, if researchers with the best of intentions are heading off to do research to tell Indigenous stories or stories about Indigenous people, then it's just really almost inevitable that there's going to be a misstep or some kind of harm if you're not engaged with and taking the lead from Indigenous communities. And so I get one of the most common questions I get is, do I need to do engagement? And I put systematic review in here because actually people, for both accessing administrative data and for things like systematic reviews, people are like, well, I'm not actually talking to people, like I'm not recruiting anybody. So I don't really need to do engagement. And, you know, some REBs even say that. But I'm here to just kind of give some clarity from my perspective to that, and not just my perspective. I'll show you some guidance on how to approach this. But it's a very common question, and I think if you're asking the question, you know that you need to do engagement. But it's the question of how that's really tricky for people. Like, how do I know if I need to? What is the extent of that? Why would I need to do it? At what points do I need to do it? Who do I need to involve? When people want to do the right thing, and it's a matter of figuring out what the best steps are. So, in answer to the first question, do I need to engage? The main answer to that question is, does the project engage with Indigenous knowledges or data? And Indigenous data refers to any and all information or knowledge from or about Indigenous people. So it's data about Indigenous people, it's data from Indigenous people, and it's facts about a nation, even if it's not about individuals. It's data about Indigenous resources and environments. So the answer, if you're asking the question, the answer is probably yes. So just to say, like, even if it's data about and stories about, then that is, then engagement, then that kind of counts as Indigenous data. So then if we've got a knowledge of that, that's what Indigenous data means, then we all have, presumably most people here, and you can put your hand up if you're like, I really have no idea what we're talking about with the TCPS. So it's the Tri-Council Policy Statement on Ethical Research with Human Participants. So there's, these things are, now most of you will have taken this training, the core training on this. Is that correct? People can put a thumbs up or something if you've taken it. If you haven't, that's a good idea to take your ethics training. Oh, look at, like, people are, okay, thumbs up. That's awesome. Thank you. Oh my gosh, that's so much more fun to look at. Anytime you want to give me a thumbs up, that sounds good because it gives me a bit of feedback. So this, in chapter 9, there's a whole, as you know, a whole chapter for related to First Nations, Inuit, Métis research. And I just want to pull a couple out because I think sometimes they're a little bit misunderstood. So where the research is likely to affect the welfare of an Indigenous community or communities to which prospective participants belong, researchers shall seek engagement with the relevant community. So things like those maps, that's important to communities. Those communities, if they don't know those maps are coming, and suddenly you're out there in the media saying that, you know, the area around this waterway is has really high rates of something, then and you haven't talked to the community about what they're doing, what they're active, that people are activated already about whatever's going on, and or if they're not, they need to know first before it's just blasted. So these are it really matters. And then they go on to specify the conditions under which engagement is required include research in which Indigenous identity or membership is used as a variable for the purposes of analysis. So even if you're like, I've had people say, well, I'm just adjusting for it, and it's only in my table 1 and I'm just adjusting for it. That's actually, you're using that variable. And I think if you're going to be talking about it, it's building into it's part of telling the story of whatever the research is that you're doing, then you need to do engagement. And then the nature and extent of community engagement shall be determined jointly by the researcher and the relevant community. So there's no cookbook, right? It's not a one way of doing it only. So it has to be appropriate to the community characteristics and the nature of the research. The other source of guidance that I'll just mention is also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This one is a bit less specific and higher level. It's about rights. It's about rights to self-determination. A lot of the rights conversations, have also become a little complicated because when finally Canada started to actually try and put this into practice, there's an UNDRIP Act, and there's a lot of conversation about the UNDRIP Act and whether it's actually going back to the real, especially the right to free, prior, and informed consent. So there's a lot of conversations about UNDRIP, but essentially it's another place to go to sort of ground yourself in what are we talking about here, and why is this different? Why is this actually not just an equity conversation? It's not just an equity conversation, it's also a rights conversation. Indigenous people have distinct rights, and UNDRIP will help us understand those rights. What it does is takes us beyond the idea of individual consent to the importance of collective consent. So you might have something where you've collected clinical data and you have individual consent to use that data, and you've asked people, are you Indigenous? And they've checked a box, First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and you're like, well, I've got individual consent to use this, so I better report on it. It doesn't mean you don't need the collective consent. There's some layer of collective consent that's required. That's what the Tri-Council policy statement is essentially saying. I mean, it's not I'm saying consent because that's the kind of language that's in the UNDRIP. That's not the kind of language in the Tri-Council policy statement. But really, like, that's where I'm trying to get your heads to think, where it's like that we have to think about this as free, prior, and informed consent. That Indigenous nations have the right to free, prior, and informed consent when stories are being told and data are being used. And I recognize that is not, there's no one straight line to that. I've done many, 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 many different kinds of engagements and projects. So, but there always is a way. There's not just one line to that. So some things, resources for you to think about these things, and some of these may have been shared with you before. I'm sorry, Linda, I did not watch everybody's presentations before this presentation. So if I'm repeating myself, I want you all to push me out of out of the rut of repeating everybody else. But one of the methodologies or frameworks that I engage quite a bit with is the two-row wampum, and that's partly because I'm Haudenosaunee, and that's the knowledges from this place and the people I'm from. But this is like one way to think about, and there's other ways, like I've seen people engage with like a medicine wheel as a framework, or I've seen people engage with a journey, a canoe journey as a framework. There's lots of different ways of grounding projects and relationships in Indigenous knowledge frameworks. And the two-row is, so you see this two-row wampum here. I had shown you before the dish wampum. This is the two-row wampum. The two-row wampum was an agreement. You remember the dish treaty was an agreement between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. This agreement was between Dutch settlers and Haudenosaunee people. And what the agreement said was that we will travel, the Dutch settlers with their ship and all the knowledges, languages, the ways of knowing, the governance structures, all their things would travel in their ship in this river. The river is, the water is white on the two-row wampum belt, and the path of the ship is in purple. And then in parallel, there'd be the canoe, the Haudenosaunee canoe, with all the knowledges, with all of the governance systems, and with all of the language. And that would sit in that canoe, and they would travel in parallel, not interfering with each other, allowing for self-determination, but working in that space in between to collaborate. So when we talk about that kind of like decolonization, things you need to do to institutions and organizations and healthcare systems, that's work that has to be done in the ship. But we can work together in the space in between to be able to inform each other. So that it has been a very helpful framing for me as an Indigenous person working in the ship, because I work at a university, and I've always worked in, other than when I was briefly consulting and working directly, more directly with First Nations organizations, I have been working in, colonial institutions. So it's that sort of like trying to understand how we do that respectfully and responsibly. And then there's others as well. I often draw on relational accountability. And if you haven't read Sean Wilson's book, which is Research as Ceremony, I would suggest that one because it's very accessible. You can buy the book, and it builds to a framework, basically a methodology of thinking about how we do research in relation to our own selves, our kin, like our own families, our own responsibilities, the community responsibilities, ancestors past, descendants, like people, land, air, water. Like it's about how we do this work in relation. And I draw on that framework quite a lot as well. So these are just some places to start to think a little bit more deeply about centering Indigenous knowledges in your work. And Indigenous data governance principles, you've done a lot of thinking about by now at this point, I think, taking OCAP and learning from the others who have given you some material to look at. But I just want to emphasize this one point, and that is Indigenous data governance principles require two things. Like Indigenous data governance requires two things. It requires the Indigenous use of Indigenous data for governance. So it requires us to be doing our research, building our data sets, creating our proposals in ways that enable Indigenous decision makers, organizations, nations to use that information for decision making. So Indigenous use of the Indigenous data. And then it also requires Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. So think for a second about where OCAP principles fit. Okay, I'm gonna just, this is like a little exercise you can do in your own head for a second. If you think about OCAP principles are ownership, control, access, and possession. It's talking about First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession of First Nations data. Those principles mostly have been applied to support Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. Mostly those principles are about setting a boundary about who can use data, when, who can access it. It's about that part of Indigenous data governance. It's about making sure that Indigenous data is protected and only the people who should be accessing it and using it can access and use it. But what we often haven't sort of developed enough of is the best ways to make sure that Indigenous decision makers are not just engaged in a project, but that the project is set up to make sure that they can use the data for paths to healing and change. I have a slide just to give you a few resources so you can learn more if these haven't been given to you before. Obviously, you know about OCAP training. There's an online course that Malcolm King was a big part of developing Indigenous community research partnerships. And you can access that even if you're not a Queen's student. If you are a Queen's student, I think you can do it for credit or something, some kind of credit. But if you aren't, you can access it anyway. And then the Saskatchewan Centre for Patient-Oriented Research has done this Indigenous research level of engagement tool, which I also find very helpful for helping people understand what does good engagement actually look like. Like, it's actually more of a checklist than I would ever do myself, but someone's done it, so I'm giving it out because it's really helpful in some ways. When people need a checklist, there is a checklist, and there's also training available from the First Nations University of Canada for that Indigenous research level of engagement tool. So I suggest those. I'm also tossing in here the Chiefs of Ontario Voices of Sovereignty podcast series, which Dominique may have already told you about because ICS partners quite closely with Chiefs of Ontario. So this is a podcast series they've developed to talk about data sovereignty. I'm going to give you my summary advice. Engage with Indigenous organizations or nations and consider full partnership and Indigenous self-determination approach when you do your research. If you are engaging with Indigenous knowledge, information, or data, you are the researcher. The researcher is responsible for alignment with Indigenous research ethics and data governance principles. You have to take that responsibility. Once you've collected Indigenous data or you've engaged with Indigenous data, you're responsible for honoring Indigenous data governance and Indigenous sovereignty. So how will you ensure that any interpretation and sharing of Indigenous research will happen only with appropriate Indigenous community engagement? This is my goal, that pragmatic trials involving Indigenous data promote Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and are respectful and inclusive of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, being, and doing. And I hope that some of this series that you've taken has helped you find the tools or at least the pathways to conversation to help along that, towards that goal. And I really just want to emphasize that shift from using research to shine a light on problems to Indigenous peoples using research to find and guide a path forward, because this is part of reconciliation. It's part of all of our responsibilities to reconciliation, which is in some ways doing what we can to support self-determination and sovereignty and getting out of the way. So I just want to say Nyawe, which means thank you, for this opportunity to talk. And I'm going to leave time now for discussion. I really hope that you can even just share something in the chat that resonated with you or that you have a question about. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I'm never sure what happens. I think once your slides come down, we'll see people. There we are. There we go. There they are. And there's our other knowledge keeper, Mary Wilson. Just by way of introduction, Jen, that's our other knowledge keeper who's been with us for the last 2 years. Thank you so much. It has been a series of 4 speakers, and each one has been so engaging. Each one has focused on different things, and I appreciate your focus on talking about data and how to make it personal, how to always keep the word relationship. That's one word that has threaded its way through every conversation we've had with our guest speakers. And I appreciate you focusing on that and trying to help us to get there. I know we have some guests here, so I will open up to questions if people would like to uh, speak. Please turn on your camera if you don't mind, and tell us if you are going to have a question. That just tell us where you're coming from, and um, go ahead. If we
It's
don't,
just, it's
sorry.
just me, Linda, Mary
Oh,
Wilson. That was an
Mary.
amazing, yeah, that was a really well done presentation. I certainly thought that you covered so much information. You did it very, very well.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for joining us. As usual, you look beautiful. Always warms my heart in the cold months here. Heather, would you like to go ahead? Will you just tell us, please, who you are and where you're coming from before you speak?
Hi, yeah, I'm in Ottawa. I'm an epidemiologist, data analyst at the University of the OHRI, the University Hospital Research Institute. We do a lot of secondary data analysis, and I find that on a personal level, I'm doing my PhD and I want to develop my personal network because my work network doesn't have a lot of Indigenous engagement. So is there anything you can recommend for I don't know, a committee or some sort of way I can get relationships that are meaningful before I have something on paper to sign, as you say, a checklist. So I really would like to hear Indigenous perspectives, but I don't have it in my personal network. How would you recommend improving that?
Thanks, Heather. Okay, so this is a good question because the first time you talk to somebody really shouldn't be like, here's my idea and do you like it and will you send me a letter of support or something, like I see that you see that. Yeah. And so this is one I don't live in Ottawa, but I would imagine that there are actually lots of opportunities, not maybe committees right off the start, but like opportunities to participate in things that are already being done, like at the Wabano Center or something where you can actually attend and learn. And build relationships naturally. So one of the things, like I don't mean to just speak in metaphors and not something concretely, but I just sometimes think about how sometimes like we know we need to build relationships, but then we sort of approach it like a project rather than like we would in our normal lives. Like if you wanted to meet more people, you would probably like, or if you wanted to like, oh, I haven't hung out with these people for a while, we should get together. You probably wouldn't like, just tell everybody we're going to meet at this time. You're going to order this food. We're going to do this. Like you would like, hey, do you want to get together? So I just like, we can approach it naturally, like human to human, natural things. And I think the best way is actually just being present and spending time. So it's hard for me sometimes to answer questions like this because I haven't, like most of my research has been responding to community needs. It hasn't been sort of me saying, I have an idea and then kind of shopping it around. So, and I know that that's sometimes the way that things happen, but it hasn't been my experience. So I have a harder time sometimes advising people. That's why my advice is really just try and have natural relationships. Show up to the health forum in Toronto. Like you can register and go to the Chiefs of Ontario Health Forum and learn and listen and be there for 2 days and hear all the different work that's happening, what their priorities are, hear from their youth council. And these aren't closed spaces. So places where there is openness to having people come and learn and be part of the conversation is the best place to go. So, yeah, like I said, I'm not in Ottawa, but definitely the Chiefs of Ontario Health Forum could be an idea, or just like any Indigenous health events or things that are hosted by even at your hospital or the university. There's probably things that are open to you to attend. I'd say just try and be chill. Try and get to know people in a real way, and not with motivations that make it like a project. Yeah.
Thank you. That resonates, of course. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, it's not very specific, but
It's all very real. I don't know if this is of use to Heather, but this year I just sat in and listened and was part of the group, which is an HDR and Indigenous data group. And everybody is from coast to coast. Again, they're all across Canada, and people are setting the agenda of what they want to do and who they want to hear. So you have some input into what you'd like to be doing that year while you're there. And they've done a lot of it. And when I just found it interesting from my perspective, and also the people who I met all across Canada.